Hey everyone, John the Morgile here. We're going to do a video response to another one of LieManDan's videos. This time his video is claiming that we absolutely went to the moon, and let's just see if he provides any evidence for this or if it's just more of the same smug regurgitation of scientism and the lies of NASA.
If there's one conspiracy that's potentially even bigger than Flat Earth, it's this one.
I'm going to step off the limb. That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
Right off the bat, he's using the weaponized term of conspiracy in order to discredit any topic they choose. And of course, I think the proper phrase would be conspiracy theory, but even just the word conspiracy itself conjures up images of a tinfoil hat wearing theory. And by the way, the Earth being a spinning ball is a theory. The Earth being flat and motionless is not a conspiracy per se. It is a fact, a self-evident fact confirmed by pretty much any physical experiment you can do in order to show either curvature of the Earth or motion of the Earth. And yet, LieManDan calls it a conspiracy. And the moon landing fakery he also alleges is a conspiracy. But if NASA actually went to the moon in the 1960s and 1970s, we would have lots of evidence for it, not just theoretical things that never come about. So if you look at the so-called evolution of, say, avionics, or the evolution of the automobile, or any other sort of technology, when it starts out it is rather simplex and rudimentary, and then very quickly, we'll just say aviation for example, the low-tech planes invented by the Wright brothers within even just 100 years have become everything from supersonic fighter jets to massive passenger jets, and of course, right up into the point where the Wright brothers built the first airplane, science with a capital S believed it was impossible for people to achieve piloted flight. But the fact of the matter is, avionics or any other technology, once it is invented, is instantly enhanced and made more complex by tacking on more and more bigger and better engineering designs and features to a thing, making it more accessible and, more importantly, making it more affordable for future generations to produce whatever that technology is, be it airplanes or automobiles or whatever. Except, of course, when it comes to fake space. Apparently, when it comes to fake space, the very first instance of piloted flight to the moon was the most complex and effective, and they did it just maybe a dozen times or so in the late 60s and early 70s. And from that point, 40 plus years later, our technology is less sufficient to carry us to the moon than it was back then. This is exactly the opposite of how technology works, and it just goes to show you that NASA was indeed lying. And there's lots of independent proof to show that NASA's images and videos were forgeries, and they continue to pump out forgeries, and there's plenty of evidence that you could point to show that. However, the blatant fact that space-age technology, well, simply doesn't exist, except for in like future plans for Virgin Atlantic, Virgin aircraft, whatever. They'll charge people money to put them on a list to go into, low Earth orbit, but they never actually achieve this technology and roll it out to the general public. You would think after over 40 years of space adventures, they would have optimized space travel and optimized low Earth orbit to the point where they should have hotels in space by now. But of course, we get just lame excuses and never any tangible, actionable technology that comes from space. So with that being said, I really would love to see what LieManDan's absolute proof that they went to the moon in the late 60s and early 70s is.
Yes, I am of course talking about the moon landings and the fact that some people don't believe that they ever happened. According to them, it was all staged on a film set. All 6 of them.
His position insinuates that you'd have to be stupid or crazy to not believe that they went to the moon, although I would say that the contrary is true. You'd have to be just completely misled and deceived, and maybe a bit gullible to believe that they did go to the moon, primarily because the moon is a light in the sky, the Earth is a stationary plane, and so therefore the moon is nothing like the Earth whatsoever. So even if you could get to where the moon is, you certainly can't walk around on it. So the fact that they claim to have gone to the moon is impossible, and it must have been forged, probably on a soundstage. But to take the position that someone is a pariah because they don't believe that people went to the moon on 60s and 70s technology, as if such a thing were even possible to go to the moon, you're just playing into the social and cultural mind control programming, and you're strictly relying on people's inability to think outside of what was presented to us in school. I believe someone must be crazy if they believe the government is not capable of lying to us, and you really must admit it certainly is much more believable that the government lied about the moon landings than the prospect that they actually went to the moon. It would be very much easier, a whole lot easier for them to fake the moon landings than to actually go to the moon, and so I don't think that it's all that conspiratorial, if you will, to entertain the prospect that NASA indeed never went to the moon and they were lying about it for all this time and continue to lie. Continue to put out blatant forgeries as proof that they're up in space orbiting the Earth and traveling to distant areas of the space-time theory.
Hello all, and welcome along to another episode of Tinfoil Tuesdays. There was an overwhelming amount of comments in support of that name, so I couldn't do anything but call it that. Thank you to everyone who supported it, and for whoever mentioned it first, if you believe it was you, please do let me know. Looking for a video to critique on the moon landings was difficult. There are so many little sub-conspiracies contained within the mothership that I could never cover all of them in one video. Not to worry though, I'm sure this won't be my first foray into the subject. I eventually settled on a video by a YouTuber called Go For It Randy. He has an issue with the lunar module that made the trip down to the moon's surface, but he starts with a now famous interview.
Hi, ladies and gentlemen, this is Go For It Randy. Listen, for those of you who want to know the truth about the moon landings, you're about to find out from the horse's mouth. Yeah, that's right. Buzz Aldrin, the guy who went to the moon first with Neil Armstrong in Apollo 11 in 1969, has stated categorically the truth about whether or not we went to the moon or not.
Stated categorically. I'm not sure you understand what categorically means. Let's have a look. Categorically. Unambiguously explicit and direct. That means in a manner that's not open to more than one interpretation. Remember that.
Why has nobody been to the moon in such a long time?
That's not an 8-year-old's question. That's my question. I want to know, but I think I know. Because we didn't go there, and that's the way it happened. And if it didn't happen, it's nice to know why it didn't happen, so in the future, if we want to keep doing something, we need to know why something stopped in the past that we wanted to keep it going.
That last sentence is important. Wanted to keep it going. He's acknowledging that we went before and we wanted to carry on going up there.
So, LieManDan's first piece of evidence he wants to discuss that absolutely proves that we absolutely went to the moon is the mincing of words by Buzz Aldrin. So, whether or not Buzz Aldrin made the statement that he made doesn't either prove or disprove that we went to the moon. So, in that sort of respect, I sort of agree with LieManDan that Buzz Aldrin's claims are not categorical denial of going to the moon. So I do agree with him there. Although I don't think that I necessarily agree with his interpretation of what Buzz Aldrin said. But my position is emphatically that what Buzz Aldrin said is absolutely not relevant to whether or not that he actually went to the moon. If our position is that Buzz Aldrin did not go to the moon and said that he did, then that makes Buzz Aldrin necessarily a liar if you believe that line of thought. And so anything that he says must be taken with a grain of salt, and that's either for him going to the moon or against him going to the moon. So was this a Freudian slip, a slip of the tongue by Buzz Aldrin? Maybe. Or is it something else, as LieManDan purports? Maybe it is something else. So in that respect, I do agree that this was not some sort of a categorical admission. On the other hand, I would say that I don't think that it's very relevant because there is so much other really excellent evidence to disprove the whole moon landing hoaxery.
Now, to start with, Buzz is clearly talking about a return mission to the moon here, not the original ones. He's addressing the young girl's point, and if you go on and continue to watch the interview, he talks about why we haven't gone back. We're already at a point where we can't be completely unambiguous. But let's see what Go For It Randy has to say.
Well, clearly you don't understand the definition of the word clearly, so let's read it aloud here. Easy to perceive, understand, or interpret. So clearly Buzz Aldrin was not being clear about what he was saying, otherwise we wouldn't be having this conversation. Let's listen to what he said again, only this time we'll cut out all of his mumbling and pandering to the little girl, trying to butter her up before answering the question. Let's listen to it one more time.
Why has nobody been to the moon in such a long time?
Because we didn't go there, and
Okay, so if he meant because we didn't go back there, how does that answer her question? So her question is, why didn't we go back to the moon? And you're saying that the answer was because we didn't go back to the moon. That's not an answer, and it really does sound like he's saying because we didn't go there. Let's say I told you one day that I went to the end of the rainbow and found the leprechaun's pot of gold. And then years later you asked me, well, why didn't we go back to the leprechaun's pot of gold and get more gold? And I said to you, well, because we didn't go there. I can see why this has raised some eyebrows in the communities that, know that they never went to the moon and know that they were lying. So why didn't you go back to the leprechaun's pot of gold at the end of the rainbow? Because we didn't go there. It doesn't answer the question. And I know, he goes on some diatribe about them not having enough money, but I'll tell you, 52 million bucks a day ain't just chump change. But let's continue on with the original video that LieManDan is responding to.
Now again, Buzz, what was the reason that we stopped going back to the moon in the past, like you just said?
because we didn't go there.
Completely out of context. Look how easy this is to do. Hey, go for it, Randy. What is it that flat earthers can't do?
Listen.
So you're saying that flat earthers don't want to listen to real evidence? They just like to dismiss it straight off the bat?
Yeah, that's right.
Okay, and where would you suggest that flat earthers need to go back to in order to rectify this?
Schools.
Awesome.
Well, what you did was completely not the same thing. The little girl point blank asked him, why did you never go back to the moon? Why have we not been back in such a long time? And he, after a bit of mumbling, he did answer her, because we never went there. So maybe this was a slip of the tongue and he meant something else, but that was the answer to the question. And you would think that somebody that's supposedly the best of the best, right? The astronauts have to be pretty much perfect in all sorts of areas. You'd think that they'd be able to answer a simple question a little better. So, perhaps you could chalk this up to his age, or maybe he was a little confused at the time, but it's not like somebody inserted him answering that question completely out of context, as you suggest. That's completely not what happened at all. Although it's exactly the sort of thing you would expect globe Earth clingers to do in order to support their position. Claim that Buzz Aldrin is being taken out of context when in fact he was not, Although, I'm not necessarily getting behind this interview as him admitting that they never went to the moon. That is what he answered to the question. Again, the question was, why have we never gone back in such a long time? Answer:
because we didn't go there, and
because we didn't go there.
Oh, this part is precious. Now, this is where Buzz schools this little 8-year-old girl on what is important.
money is a good thing. If you want to buy new things, new rockets, instead of keep doing the same thing over, then it's going to cost more money in America and millions of people around the world.
I genuinely don't understand Go For It Randy's point here. In the years leading up to the moon landings, NASA's budget was between 2 and 5% of the total federal budget. Last year, it was only 0.47%. I think finances is a great argument as to why we haven't been back.
Well, this truly has nothing to do with finances and what percentage NASA takes up or whatever. Think about it this way. What if Henry Ford invented an automobile and invented the ways to mass produce it and did it for, let's say, 1 year? And then the next year, Ford shut down their doors because they had destroyed the technology to build their cars. Well, one could probably argue, well, did you ever really even have that technology, or was it just a publicity stunt because we don't see any cars coming out? It's just absurd to think that NASA achieved the technology to carry people to the moon, and now, 40 some odd years later, they don't have that technology. And in fact, according to NASA, they don't even have the technology to get out of low Earth orbit. So let me play just a couple of clips of NASA people on NASA's payroll making these exact statements. First, that we destroyed the technology to go to the moon, and second, that we need to test new technologies just to get us outside of low Earth orbit or beyond the so-called Van Allen radiation belts.
Radiation like this could harm the guidance systems, onboard computers, or other electronics on Orion. Naturally, we have to pass through this danger zone twice, once up and once back. But Orion has protection. Shielding will be put to the test as the vehicle cuts through the waves of radiation. Sensors aboard will record radiation levels for scientists to study. We must solve these challenges before we send people through this region of space. Shielding will be put to the test as the vehicle cuts through the waves of radiation. We must solve these challenges before we send people through this region of space.
I'd go to the moon in a nanosecond. The problem is we don't have the technology to do that anymore. We used to, but we destroyed that technology, and it's a painful process to build it back again.
So which is it? Is it as Buzz Aldrin says, that we went to the moon, but it costs a lot of money to buy new rockets because you don't want to keep using the same old rockets to go to the moon? That would be ridiculous. You need money to buy new rockets and not keep doing the same thing over and over again. Whereas modern astronaut Don Pettit says that they used to have the technology but destroyed the technology. So which is it? Did we have the technology and destroy it? Or did the technology that we used to go to the moon somehow become obsolete and we needed lots more money to buy new ways to get to the moon? So we just, it doesn't make sense. And
Money is a good thing.
I mean, can you really make sense of this as a rational person? That NASA basically demanded loads and loads of money in order to win the alleged space race between Russia and put a man on the moon. So we spend all this money and time and effort and manpower and astronomical undertaking or astronomical deception only to destroy that technology and then use the excuse that the technology was somehow obsolete. So you demanded all that money to get us to the moon, destroyed that technology, now it's time to give you a bunch of new money for a new way to get to the moon. I mean, that is just absurd. frankly.
If you want to buy new things, new rockets, instead of keep doing the same thing over, well, then it's going to cost more money in America.
I'd go to the moon in a nanosecond. The problem is we don't have the technology to do that anymore. We used to, but we destroyed that technology, and it's a painful process to build it back again.
You can find these sort of discrepancies in NASA's claims all over the place. One of the biggest ones would be whether or not astronauts can see stars from outer space. Many of them claim that they can't see any stars, and in fact, the universe from space is the blackest black, like a velvet with a black sheen. And other astronauts claim that you can see so many stars and planets that you normally can't even see from the ground with the naked eye. So in that respect, it's hard to pick out the constellations because of all the other stars in the way. So it is these sort of discrepancies that go to show that NASA is completely full of it, and the people who work for NASA, at least the astronauts, are liars.
Now, I have a lot more evidence to show you, ladies and gentlemen, to prove to you that Apollo 11 did not land on the moon. And clearly this photograph will show you, because this photograph was taken on the moon, and that is either Buzz Aldrin or Neil Armstrong standing next to the Apollo 11 lunar module on the moon in 1969. I believe it was June 20th or July 20th, 1969. Ladies and gentlemen, there's a problem, okay? Houston, we have a problem.
We do indeed. I think he's about to go full tinfoil hat.
Okay, if you look under the landing pods there, you can clearly see underneath the rocket engine there, there's no crater, okay? Where's the crater? I mean, this thing has 10,000 pounds of thrust, and there's no crater. There's no evidence of any sign that this rocket engine ever fired as it was landing. I mean, come on, ladies and gentlemen.
Upon first hearing, I can understand why some people may think, wow, he's got a point there. You can also see why conspiracy theorists lap this one up too. However, our good old friend science can thoroughly debunk this one. Let's let him finish his point before we rip it to shreds.
I would just mention that by science he means unwavering beliefs in the claims of theorists, which is of course pseudoscience and anti-science, whereas science would mean following the evidence wherever it leads you, and his belief system is merely dogmatic beliefs in men and their theories while ignoring science. Just thought I'd get that in there.
But as you can see, the rocket engine there, you can see the cowling around the bottom of the rocket engine there, that grayish looking thing. And guess what? That thing has over 10,000 pounds of thrust, which anyone knows, you know, if you took a garden variety, leaf blower, and you went outside and you had, let's say you had a really good leaf blower and you pointed it down into the dirt or into the sand. Imagine pointing a leaf blower into the sand. What kind of a hole you could make with a leaf blower. This thing is like 10,000 leaf blowers on steroids. Okay, so how in the heck could this rocket engine not make any hole at all underneath the lunar module here?
Now, first off, we need to discuss mass. The moon is a quarter of the size of Earth, and as such has a weaker gravitational pull, which means less thrust is required to slow the rate of descent when landing on it.
What's interesting is that they could rarely, if ever, get the so-called lunar landing module to successfully land on Earth during test runs. And in fact, Neil Armstrong was allegedly nearly killed while trying to land the lunar module on Earth. If you look at the thing, it is absolutely not aerodynamically feasible. It wanted to naturally tip over because of the weight distribution on the thing. And the idea that they blind tested that on the moon for the first time ever, nationally televised this sort of Hail Mary of Hail Marys adventures, knowing full well that the thing could go catastrophic at any minute. You would think that they would never televise something like that live unless they knew going in that it was going to be a success because under controlled conditions and it was faked, so they didn't have any sort of reservations about nationally televising such a precarious scientific experiment where not only were they attempting to land the lunar module successfully for the first time, but they were also trying to land it on the moon for the first time. So this all sounds very fishy, but your initial argument is that because the moon has less gravity, therefore it would have been much easier for them to land. But let's see where you're going with this, because it's sort of irrelevant, and you would expect to see some sort of a remnant of those jets hitting the moon, or perhaps you wouldn't, but let's continue on.
Secondly, the surface they were landing on was solid rock, with a very fine layer of dust nestled on top. You wouldn't expect to see a blast crater here under Earth conditions, let alone on the moon.
Well, I think it could be argued that you wouldn't see a blast crater on the moon because it's supposedly in a vacuum, although as you point out later, you can see dust being agitated away from the faked lunar landing shots, as you point out in a minute. But if you look at images like this from NASA, where it almost seems like the lunar surface has a few inches of very thick dust ubiquitously everywhere on the surface, it does make some degree of sense that you would expect to see a disturbed area cleared of any dust beneath the lunar module, compared to the area outside of the blast radius, if you will, which should be a couple inches thick in dust, according to the images like this. But again, I would say that since the moon is allegedly a vacuum, I just don't see how any sort of thrust could disturb the dust away from the lunar surface, as you see in these animations that you show in a second. So, but what does this prove? Certainly we could agree that it is possible that photos or videos in general can be faked. So just because you see something on video does not necessarily mean that it is 100% up and up real. And if we can at least agree on the principle that videos can be faked, then really video evidence doesn't amount to anything when it's coming from an entity like NASA, who's been caught faking all sorts of things. And so the question becomes is how far do you trust a compulsive or well-known liar? Pathological liar, perhaps, in the case of NASA.
If you want to get really technical, I've written a detailed explanation in the description which highlights the engine's capabilities and its effect on the lunar soil.
Well, I went ahead and read the comment in the description section, and I wouldn't say that it's all very technical. Reiterates what NASA claims. So you say in your description section, quote, "The maximum thrust of the descent propulsion system of the lunar module was 10,125 pounds. However, it was not used above 60% of its maximum. So let's say the absolute most thrust used was approximately 6,000 pounds. Although during the descent it would not have been this much. And then the diameter of the exhaust nozzle was 59 inches. Which means that an area of 2,732 inches squared. Pressure is force divided by area, so the total pressure exerted here is approximately 2.2 pounds per square inch. Really, what difference does it make how much thrust NASA claims were in their rocket engines? The fact of the matter is, in the video that you believe in, it shows the dust being parted from underneath of the lunar module, and yet in images subsequent to that, you find that it appears the dust underneath is undisturbed. So this is a direct, obvious disconnect and incontinuity in the very video footage that you point to as evidence for the moon landing. And so how can we take this as evidence for the moon landing when in one video it shows the dust being parted by the rocket, and in the next video it shows the underneath of the rocket being filled with dust, just like all the other areas around that. But it's sort of irrelevant because it's just claims by NASA, and even if they did build these things, that doesn't prove that they went to the moon. And just because NASA claims that it went to the moon and has specifications of how their thrusters operated, does not prove that they actually went there.
Now the cherry on top, of course, is the fact that the lunar module did not descend completely perpendicular to the surface and came in at more of an angle. Take a look at the footage. You can even see the fine dust being blown away.
Seconds. Lights on. Forward. Forward. 40 feet down, 2.5. Picking up some dust. Great shadow. 4 forward, drifting to the right a little. 30 seconds. Forward.
Beautiful, isn't it?
Well, for that matter then, Dan, shouldn't we expect to see a very long canyon of disturbed areas of dust and moon dirt that have been swept away by this high velocity lunar module coming in with its thrusters, thrusting out in a way all that dust that you can see as it's allegedly landing in the fake video that doesn't look realistic at all? Why don't we see this very large canyon area of disturbed dust as you would necessarily expect to see if this is actual footage of them landing? Goodness gracious, man. I don't see how you can get away with just making the most ridiculous arguments that prove nothing and then pretending like you've made some sort of a valid point, but in reality you've made no sort of a valid point at all. By saying that it disturbed, not just one little pile of dust was disturbed, but an entire veritable streak of dust must have been disturbed then, and yet we still don't see any dust disturbed anywhere near the lunar module on the so-called moon footage. So, I mean, your argument not only holds no water, but it makes the problem even worse for NASA. What are you talking about?
In fact, there's no scorch marks. It looks like perfectly pristine, like soil of some kind, and I don't see any black marks under there either. So does anyone see any black marks there? No, you don't see anything there.
The lunar module used Aerozone 50 fuel and an oxidizer. These two propellants burn on contact with a clear flame, so no, you wouldn't see anything there at all.
So even though we should see disturbed dust all around the lunar module, and yet we don't see any disturbed dust anywhere near the lunar module, however, because we shouldn't see burn marks there, and we don't see burn marks there, then that somehow proves we went to the moon? Like, I don't understand the point. What it is that LieManDan is just going to argue with anything and everything that somebody says if they are going against the dogmas of scientism. And that's just exactly the same thing that, as sad as it is to say, people are trained to execute these programmings of rejecting anything and everything coming from a source who threatens their paradigm. And it makes it very difficult to deal with people like that. But so far, the evidence that we absolutely went to the moon, coming from LieManDan, is lacking. Really, all he's done is argue semantics most of the time, and then do ridiculous stunts like this, where his excuse for NASA in this instance is that, well, the lunar module was coming in at an angle, so it would have disturbed the dust in a long streak along the ground of the moon, and yet we don't see any dust disturbed. And so, but he sits there like, haha, see, like, this is my proof, and sits back and relishes his perceived win. And unfortunately, there's a lot of people that buy into this nonsense, and he's not proving anything. He's just making assertions that jive with the preconceived narrative, most people's paradigm, and pretending like he's scoring points where he's really done nothing of the sort at all. If this guy's antics and refusal to concede valid points are the best that the globe earthers have, then that's sad, but you know, maybe that's all that they need to be effective in that realm, because most people are going to believe this as long as he is convincing and assertive, and that's about the end of most people's research.
So let's take a look over here to the right, and we're going to take a look at the landing pods. Yeah, take a look at that landing pod there, ladies and gentlemen. Looks like it's cleaner than it was the day that they put that gold metal foil around it. I mean, it looks absolutely pristine. There's not one drop or one speck of dust on there anywhere, ladies and gentlemen. You can look at the other pod back there as well. So how can these pods be so clean when you have a 10,000 pounds of thrust coming from a rocket engine that's no more than, what, 1.5 feet, 2 feet off the ground?
Come on, NASA. If you're faking this sort of thing, you need to get the details right, guys. Come on. And don't tell me details schmeetails. Okay, look. We clearly saw in the video dust being blown away from the lunar module upon descent. It's also important to note that the lack of atmosphere on the moon means that the dust will fall straight back down to the moon's surface, as there's no air currents to keep it aloft.
That may seem valid, although it allegedly takes very, very long stretches of hundreds of years for even just a very small layer of dust to allegedly form on the moon, according to the LIE-ence of NASA. And so if that dust were disturbed straight up and then landed straight back down, it certainly would look different than the surrounding ambient dust that was undisturbed. And the velocity of that dust would also have blown it away from where it was sitting before. So it's not like it would just go straight up and then fall straight down in every single instance. Perhaps some of the dust may have, fallen straight up and down, but much of it would have been blown out and away from its original position. You can't say that the lack of atmosphere is going to prevent these dust particles from traveling, because in fact the lack of atmosphere would allow the dust particles to travel much further than were there an atmosphere present.
Of course, the real killer is the fact that the engine shuts off about 6 feet from the surface.
Yeah, don't you remember? The dust that was not disturbed was disturbed by the rockets coming in, so there wouldn't have been any dust to get into the landing feet, because you saw it on the video being disturbed, yet you saw it on the other video where the dust was undisturbed. This is evidence of nothing but forgery.
And what's with all this pyramid symbology that they have all over this thing? Look at the pyramids. There's 2 pyramids. One, it looks like it's made out of curtain rods there. And this other one over here to the right, that little tiny pyramid over there, what is that for? I mean, to me, it clearly looks like they're just trying to put pyramid symbology right in your face.
Absolutely pointless observation. There's a load of rectangles and trapeziums on there too, Pointless.
Now, look at this. Does that look like a refrigeration unit or an air conditioning unit?
Nope, that's the aft equipment bay.
And is that supposed to be a rocket there?
No, they are reaction control thrusters.
And what's with all the aluminum foil around the edges of this thing? That looks totally fake, totally phony.
This was used for insulation and was intentionally crumpled by hand to minimise points that could jeopardise its insulating capabilities.
With all the curtain rods and everything there, and then when you zone in on the rocket propulsion, let's take a look at the rockets, ladies and gentlemen. Oh, wow, there you have it, ladies and gentlemen. Take a look at those 4 rockets that they have here right on the corner there. Those things look like little cups or something. I mean, I've seen, you go to 7-Eleven and you get one of their big gulps there, 32-ounce big gulps. It looks like they're going to be bigger cups than these cones that are on these rockets here. Are you kidding me? No way did that lift off this spacecraft off the moon.
These thrusters were not used to take off from the moon. They're called reaction control thrusters, and they're used to correct the spacecraft's trajectory in flight. The lunar module ascent engine is effectively hidden between the 2 parts of the lunar module. Here is a short clip of Apollo 17 taking off from the moon. You can see the separation of the 2 parts at liftoff.
99, proceeded, 3, 2, 1, ignition. Right away, Houston. Vector good. X-thought.
But basically, they want you to believe that this went to the moon and then lifted off the moon to come back to Earth. Now, I don't know about you, but I'm not buying it. I believe this is the biggest hoax of all time. And you heard Buzz. They didn't go to the moon, and they sure as heck didn't go to the moon in this pile of crap. There is no way this thing could make it back to Earth. No way.
Well, it's not used to get back to Earth, unless of course you're in Apollo 13. This is.
Oh, well, that just proves everything.
I am absolutely positive that I'll be tackling this topic again, but for now, let's be safe in the knowledge that Go For It Randy has been confidently dispatched.
And by confidently dispatched, he actually means LieManDan made unsubstantiated claims, made points that actually made the situation for NASA even worse than they were before by arguing that the dust was kicked up in a long streak because the lunar module was in motion when it was landing, and yet we can clearly see that no dust was disturbed. And this is all begging the assumption that NASA actually went to the moon and took this footage. And there's just so much evidence, and wasn't even covered in this video, but a great deal of evidence to support that NASA has faked everything it's ever done in space, that it was designed as a psychological operation and was in part founded by literal Nazis. It goes without saying that we cannot trust NASA, yet we get people like LieManDan who make just absolute ridiculous cases for NASA's legitimacy, proves nothing, and yet ends the conversation as if he's won. What a load of crap. Alright guys, well that about wraps this one up, so I'm going to peace out of here. If you'd like to support this channel, you can make a contribution direct to PayPal at www.paypal.me/themorgile, or a recurring contribution through Patreon at www.patreon.com/themorgile. Thanks so much to everyone that's supported the channel so far. God bless you guys, and as always, spread the word, spread the world, and peace out everybody.
Make the earth shake.